Okay, so welcome to Brown Bag History for May 4th, 2022. Okay, and so as we start, we acknowledge that the land around Revelstoke and on the Columbia River and its tributaries is traditional Sinixt territory. We acknowledge the ties of the Secwepemc, the Okanagan Nation Alliance, and the Ktunaxa to this land. We acknowledge our use and inhabitation of this land sacred to these four nations. We respectfully honor their traditions and culture. So this year, this winter and spring is the 80th anniversary of the establishment of the Japanese internment program in Canada as part of the national defense strategy. Once the Pearl Harbor was attacked in December of 1941, and Canada and the Allies declared war against Japan. A lot of the Japanese in Canada were being looked at with suspicion, and the original plan was to by the government was to remove only Japanese national males between the ages of 17 to 45 and placed them in work camps in BC and Alberta. That was estimated to be about 1,700 people. But I think there was a lot of pressure to remove all Japanese people from the coast. And some of that pressure had an economic bias to it. You know, there was a lot of Japanese businesses operating on the coast, fishers and merchants and farmers. And there was, you know, to put it cynically, there was some who felt that, you know, that it was a good economic move to remove Japanese from the coast. So the decision was made to remove all Japanese people from the coast. They had a restricted zone that they referred to that covered most of the lower mainland area. So all people from there were all Japanese people from there were forced to leave, whether or not they'd been born in Canada or not. So that's when the camps were set up, and throughout the interior of the province, there was camps at a place called Tashme, which is near Hope. There were also camps in Sandon, Lemon Creek, Slocan, New Denver, Caslow, Greenwood, and families were relocated to those camps, men, women, and children. But a lot of the men, instead of being put in the camps with their families, they were put into work camps. And there was correspondence between the government departments about various road projects in BC where they could use the Japanese men as laborers. The Revelstoke Sicamous road project was number 3 on the list of preferred projects. The road had been open between Revelstoke and Sicamous since 1922, but they saw this as a way to do some improvements on the road and widen it. So there was definitely a work project there, and it was felt that they could create camps throughout the Eagle Pass for their men. They said that it would be a good way to quickly absorb 500 to 600 men, and rather than putting them into the family camps where they wouldn't have work to do. The men who were in the camps were to be paid 25 cents an hour for 8-hour days, but they were to pay for their meals out of that and supply their own blankets and clothing. So it was expected if they, after their expenses, they could net up to $33 a month. And then they were paying, if they were men that had dependents in other camps, they were paying them additional amount for their dependents as well. But they were very, very low wages compared to going wages at the time. And as I say, they were expected to pay their own expenses. There was some concern that the road paralleled the main line of the CPR and crossed the line several times. So there was some concern about potential sabotage to the railway, but I think that there was more concerned that they just have these men doing an occupation, so they kind of let go the idea of potential sabotage, and these camps were patrolled as well. So in 1942, they opened camps throughout Eagle Valley, at Three Valley, Taft, Solsqua, Yard Creek, and Griffin Lake. So there were several camps operating out there. This is one of the camp at Three Valley, and it was located when you pass Three Valley Gap and drive by the lake and head up the hill. It was, as you head up the hill, it was just on the left, in that area. Their original intention was to keep the Japanese nationals in separate camps from the naturalized citizens and the Canadian-born men, but that wasn't practical, and that didn't really happen. In April of 1942, the April 16th edition of the newspaper reported that the Japanese road crews were filling up. So during the week, Japanese have been arriving from the coast to fill up the camps on the West Road. Outfit cars are parked on the siding at Three Valley, Taft, Cambie, and Solsqua. Carpenter gangs are busily engaged in erecting camps on the highway, which will be occupied shortly by the Japanese. In addition to the camps above mentioned, also to be established at Griffin Lake and on Mara Lake. Each of the outfit cars is under guard by special constables of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. A large number of local men have found employment as cooks, timekeepers, and in other capacities. The foremen are local men as well. This is an interesting statement, and I'm not sure where they decided that this was accurate. The Japanese are young men and appear to be quite pleased with their lot. Members of a road gang which arrived Tuesday were in Revelstoke that afternoon buying personal requirements at local stores. Honorable R.W. Bruin, Minister of Public Works, is expected to make an inspection of the camp shortly. So yeah, that seemed to be pleased with their lot. There's some good documentation about the camps. One of the best sources is this book. We just have a section of a book called The Exiles, an archival history of the World War II Japanese road camps in British Columbia and Ontario. And he has a chapter in here on Revelstoke. I was able to get quite a bit of information from there. And it does talk about some complaints being made and a little bit of a disagreement and almost a little bit of a standoff between some of the older men who were in one of the work camps, and they were very quickly removed and put into a prison camp. So I think people realized right away that you didn't say much. So that's perhaps why they were seen as being pleased with their lot. What they might have been was being resigned to their lot. Unfortunately, very quickly, there was a fatality when a young man, aged 22, man named Yoshio Shiraishi, drowned when he fell from a raft that he'd taken out onto Three Valley Lake from the camp there. It was luckily there was really not that many fatalities, but this was the first one. Said it occurred about 150 feet from shore, and as he fell, Shiraishi yelled for help, but disappeared before a fellow countryman who swam out from shore could reach him. Local police were notified and began dragging operations. The body was found after 4 hours and brought to Revelstoke last night. And they did hold an inquiry and brought in a verdict of accidental death. And it mentioned that the police were trying to contact the victim's family. Meanwhile, in Revelstoke, the city council was certainly pleased with the work camps, because, as it mentioned, there were several local people who were getting work there as cooks and as foremen, and a lot of the local businesses were being used to supply food and other supplies for the camps. But at the same time, they were really restricting any other Japanese from coming into the city. They had a council resolution in March of 1942 that all applications from Japanese families wishing to settle in Revelstoke be refused. And some families had the means to be able to relocate outside the restricted zone without being put into camps. And several families did come here, and there were Japanese families living here prior to the war. So there were connections with some of those families, and some of the Japanese families tried to settle here, but they were not allowed to settle within city limits. But city limits at that time did not include Big Eddy, and it did not include land on the south side of Downey and South. So the most of the south side area was not in city limits at that time. So there were several families that did settle there, including the Wakitas, who became a very well-known family in town. But the city they were really restricting who could live in Revelstoke. They made one exception to that. There was a Reverend Mr. Nomoto, who was appointed by the United Church of Canada to serve the Japanese residents in this district, and also the Japanese men in the work camps. And because he was sponsored by the United Church of Canada, he was allowed to live within city limits. But none of the other Japanese families were. But then that came back to bite them in shortly afterwards, because in May of 1942, there was a big notice in the paper right up about the city council meeting, saying that they'd been informed that their resolution opposing the presence of Japanese within the city limits was being construed to mean that Japanese were unwelcome in the city at any time. And the council, they wanted to allow the Japanese men from the camps and the Japanese who were living in the district to be able to come to the city and shop. It said that they wanted to allow the Japanese men in the work camps the opportunity to do business in Revelstoke, and stated that Revelstoke merchants should have the opportunity to benefit from the purchases which the workers would make. So they were definitely wanting the money that the Japanese men could bring from their paychecks. So they did pass a resolution instructing the city clerk to write the BC Security Commission, asking that the Japanese be permitted to come to Revelstoke to make necessary purchases. There was also a suggestion that they be allocated specific days to come to town, and that was put in place. There was a man named Frank Muratsugu at Yard Creek Camp, and he said, the camps around here each have a certain day when members are allowed to visit Revelstoke. And as our day is Saturday, it is said that we are the envy of the other camps, because there would have been a Saturday matinee at the Avonlea Theatre. So they were kind of, the other people were envious of them. But well-dressed young men there in their fedoras. That's of course right on the corner of First and Mackenzie. And they had a newspaper called the New Canadian, which was being published by some of the Japanese internees at Kaslo, and it was called the New Canadian. So there were several letters from the camps around this area sent to the New Canadian. There was this one fellow, Robert Oikawa, wrote to the Japanese New Canadian in July 4th, 1942, from Griffin Lake. And he said, at present, there are 51 of us in camp here, ranging in age from 16 to 58. 14 are naturalized Canadian, and the rest are Canadian born. The lake is but a few minutes walk from the camp. Having the privilege of using 3 boats owned by a Revelstoke resident, we can go boating or swimming in the clear, cold water. Each week, 12 of us are allowed to visit Revelstoke, where we are well received. We are permitted to stay and take in a show. Several families are residing there. In the same letter, Robert Oikawa said, on the evening of June 27th, a Shinboku Kai, or social event, was held. The foreman, staff, and guards were invited. And said the highlight of the evening's entertainment was musicals and solos. And he said that work at the camp consisted of clearing brush and trees along the proposed right-of-way, and some unfinished work of clearing and building around the camp, as well as everyday chores. One of the people living at the Griffin Lake camp wrote this poem. Great mountains tower above its shores, green rushes fringe its brim, and o'er its breast forevermore the wanton breezes skim. Sunset and sunrise crowned with gold the peaks of ageless stone, where winds have thundered from of old and storms have set their throne. There was also a note from in the New Canadian in July of 1942 by Frank Moritsugu from Yard Creek, BC camp. And the headline of his article was Malaqua Mauls Many Murderous Mosquitoes. And he said, brushing aside swarms of mosquitoes, which are of a very bloodthirsty variety, this correspondence will try to give you belated news of what's happening at the No. 2 camp at Yard Creek. Our camp was first called Canby Siding, at which place we stayed until a month ago in bunk cars. Then we moved here, Yard Creek, which is 3 to 4 miles east of Canby. Most of us have never seen, or rather felt, so big and so many mosquitoes as they have here. Mosquito nets, ointments, and mosquito repellents are being bought in such amounts that the storekeeper at Malaqua should be able to retire soon if this mosquito epidemic keeps up. He said on Sundays, and this is a cartoon by Frank Moritsugu. It says on Sundays, we have the one thing that keeps us going. That is the weekly baseball game with Salsqua, the nearest camp, over 7 miles away at the Canby Ball Grounds. Great cartoon. And there's the ball grounds at Canby. There was a report in the letter to the Board of Trade in July of 1942 that there were then 500 Canadian born and naturalized citizens in 7 camps throughout the Eagle Valley. In February of 1943, there was a hockey game held between the high school boys of Revelstoke and the Japanese team from the Griffin Lake Road camp in the local rink. So the high school boys won 5-3. It was said the Japanese players showed good combination play, but they were unable to overcome the more aggressive tactics of their opponents. So there they are practicing. This is at the Griffin Lake camp. In February of 1943, it was reported that Japanese from the road camps on the Revelstoke to Sicamous Highway were passing through Revelstoke en route to and from New Denver and other points in that vicinity. They were being given 2 weeks vacation, which they were spending with friends and relatives in the area. It was reported in February of 1943 that local farmers sold 77 tons of vegetables to the camps. Henry Popplewell was the secretary of the Farmers Institute and chairman of the Agricultural Committee of the Board of Trade. He told members of the Board of Trade that 77 tons of vegetables had been supplied from farms in the Revelstoke district for the Japanese road camps between Revelstoke and Sicamous. Most of the vegetables had been grown by women and children, and he thought they deserved the greatest credit for their achievement. There was also the Rutherfords had a farm at the bottom of the hill at Three Valley, and they were also supplying meat and produce to the camps. There's lots of you know, I haven't recorded a lot of it, but there's a lot of interesting comments in that were published in the book called The Exiles. Here's one little note by somebody who was at one of the camps. Said, one of the pleasant things about camp life is that everyone, whether he be young or old, strong or weak, is regarded as equal. Because of this fact, it is extremely peaceful here. But since we find no hope in this form of life and are unable to see beautiful women here, spirit and charm are lacking in our life. Unfortunately, there is no way of alleviating this condition here other than through participation in music and haiku. And the haiku says, no women, no wine, only fully green mountains. So remember, these were young men there. It said, some men spend their leisure hours looking for wildflowers among the brush and trees and transplanting these to the camp garden. Being hungry for news, we all wait for the arrival of the new Canadian. There is some talk too in this camp of purchasing a long wave radio. Of course, radios then had to be licensed. So whether they were able to get that, I haven't been able to find. But you know, some real, you know, a lot of them had a sense of humor, and they kind of were resigned to what was going on, but it didn't make it any better for them. Another person says, brushing aside swarms of mosquitoes. Oh, sorry, that was one that I'd already read by Frank. He said, our camp is just on the railway by a roaring creek, after which it is named. We have running water for 2 or 3 weeks now, and any day we hope to have hot running water in the kitchen. Our work, like the other camps in the Revelstoke Sicamous area, consists of widening the narrow or at present 2-car wide highway. In achieving this, the young and old workers are engaged in clearing brush and burning it and felling the bigger trees, which are sawed into firewood. So much for work. Our recreation time is filled with the usual card games and listening to the radio. So they did get a radio, making articles out of birch bark, and most important of all, trying to kill mosquitoes and scratch the various bites. So there's a wash day in the camp. And by February of 1943, there were rumors that the work camps on the Revelstoke to Sicamous Road might be closing. Announcement was made that the Japanese in BC would be asked to go to the prairies in Ontario to work on sugar beet farms. But there was no substantiation of that, and the camps did remain open. There was assurance by one of the members of Parliament that the camps would remain open, because, as I said, it was definitely a benefit to the local economy as well. The Board of Trade said, if the local project is to be closed, it would be reasonable to assume that Japanese employed on the Hope-Princeton Road would also be shifted east. The local Board of Trade, which was instrumental in having the camps located in this vicinity, can be relied on to do everything possible to have the camps remain on the West Road. Not only has the project meant a great deal to Revelstoke at the present time, but it will represent still more when tourist travel is resumed and the Revelstoke-Sicamous Highway is in a suitable condition for tourist traffic. It was noted in May of 1943 that Herbert Anscombe, the Minister of Public Works, had inspected the camps and said the Japanese in the camps on this highway project had done very efficient work. In June of 1943, engineer N.E. Willett was in charge of 250 men in the various camps between Sicamous and Revelstoke. So some of them had been moved on. He was satisfied with the work being done. Said the project has meant a great deal to Revelstoke people who have found employment in key positions, as well as to the business life of the community. In August of 1943, the New Canadian newspaper commented on a report in the House of Commons that the Japanese on the Hope-Princeton Highway were doing little work of value. The Minister Crerar said, the men were not giving as much work as might be expected from them. But the New Canadian said that if that complaint is true, it could be tied to the wage of 25 cents an hour, out of which 75 cents per day is taken for food and lodging and $1 a month for medical expenses. The New Canadian went on to say, for 18 months, these men have been cut off from all normal society, isolated in the rudest of lonely wilderness camps, engaged in work of no immediate national or wartime need. Their wages are a third of what many civilian war workers in the country today do not hesitate to strike over. By August of 1943, many of the Japanese had left the road camps. Over 800 had them left for other essential work in the province or on prairie farms and in Eastern Canada. So from July 31st, 1942, when 1,447 Japanese men were located in the camps on the project, and also in the North Thompson Highway and the Hope-Princeton Highway, 796 had left for logging, lumbering, and fruit farm jobs. By late in 1943, the camps were reduced to 3 at Yard Creek, Griffin Lake, and Taft. It was a sad note, and I didn't find this previously in any of my research, but Tomo Fujimura who's done a lot of research for us in terms of the Japanese community in BC and in this area, found a national defense report that mentioned the death of a man named Giamano, but there was no other details. So I looked it up in the newspaper, and I found that this 20-year-old Giamano died when the truck that he was driving plunged into Three Valley Lake. There were 3 other passengers, all Revelstoke residents, non-Japanese, who survived. Amano actually was not in the work camp, but he lived with his parents on Downey Street, where they had relocated. And he was returning home from work on the camp, on the road work. He was driving the Davidson's transfer work truck. His body was never recovered. But I'd never heard that name before, and I'd never heard of that incident before. So it made me do a little bit more digging. And I did find a record of an Amano family who was living in Revelstoke. And then I discovered that they actually had the building, which later became the meat lockers next to where the red and white store was, where Revelstoke Trading Post is now. He had a building there, and he was actually manufacturing soy sauce, and it was a soy manufacturing company. And I'd never heard of that before either. So further research, we found that some of the young man who died, some of his siblings were going to high school here. So we found the name in the high school records. And then we discovered that in 1950, they had sold the property to the Wakita family, who were going to build a meat locker on that location. And we believe that they relocated back to the Lower Mainland at that time, and kept digging and discovered that the Amano miso company is still in business today. The parents who were here ran it, and then their son, who went to high school here, ran it, and now his children run it. I believe you can buy it at Southside, the Amano miso sauce. That was something that I hadn't known before. It was just through this, through just finding that name from Tomo and then digging that we were able to make that connection. And in June 15th of 1944, the newspaper reported that there had been extensive improvements made on the highway. Said the Yard Creek, Griffin Lake, and Taft camps were still in operation, with Yard Creek expected to close this week. And the men were gradually leaving the other two camps. At present, said there were fewer than 50 Japanese men left, and a further 59 left on May 20th. That at the present rate of leaving, it is obvious that the project may close before long, unless the Provincial Public Works Department is able to carry on. It has been suggested that conscientious objectors be placed on the project, but so far there's been no official reaction to the suggestion, and that didn't happen. The N.E. Willett, who was the engineer in charge of the project, said, "The camps have been well constructed and have excellent facilities for camp habitation. They were built for use summer and winter. The entire route from Three Valley has been relocated, and while most of the work has been done, sections here and there need completion, and additional resurfacing work was required in places." But they said that a lot of work had been done during the time that the camps were there. So that anyone traveling over the road and recalling the condition of the highway some years back will agree that a substantial amount of work has been done. So by July 13th, 1944, all of the camps were closed, and they had all of the Japanese men had been removed from the camps. It said only one of the BC camps was still open at that time. So the local project was composed entirely of Canadian-born Japanese, and these were the first available for other work. Other projects are composed largely of Japanese nationals. So that was basically the end of the project. But for 2 years, those young men were located there and did a tremendous amount of work and contributed to the local economy and contributed to the building of the highway. There has been an apology and redress in past years done by the Government of Canada. There's some good resources out. This is a book called Righting Canadian Wrongs, Japanese-Canadian Internment in the Second World War. It's a very good book that really outlines what happened during the internment, and it talks about the redress as well. And this is also a really good one that has a lot of stories of people who were in the camps, both work camps and the family camps, honoring our people breaking the silence. Thank you for coming today. Our next Brown Bag History on May 18th is going to be about the Mount Cartier community. And after that one, we will be showing the film as well, but not on Zoom, but just for anyone who's here. So going to thank our Zoom audience, and this will be up on YouTube shortly. Thank you for coming.